welcome everybody. A lot of people I don't know, which is fantastic as always. Steve's drawn his crowd. My name's Adrian Marshall. I'm the facilitator of the Grassy Plains Network. We're part of the Victorian National Parks Association these days. And it's, yes, my great pleasure to be hosting these Grassy Talks, of which this must be the 23rd, I think. So been going 2.5 years or so now, which is fabulous. Before I introduce Steve, I should first pay my respects to the traditional owners, and normally that's the Bunyarong, Wadawurrung and Wurundjeri in particular, of which Melbourne has landed on. But I should extend those to all the traditional owners of Victoria and say a very sincere thank you. Your land was never ceded, which is very important to remember, and to profess my heartfelt sorrow at the profound way that we've trashed the joint in the last couple of 100 years, and hope that we can do a lot better moving forward. Steve Sinclair, what can I say about Steve? He's been a ARI scientist, senior scientist, which is what he is now, but he's been a scientist there for 20 years. He loves plants. He's an ecologist. He's a very keen observer of the bush. It's always remarkable hearing Steve talk when he comes back from a walk. He says, "Oh, I saw a peacock spider and this, that, and the other." And there's always like this comprehensive list of things that I would never, ever have seen. He's a Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands, which is why he's here tonight. His interests are broad in the plant world, running from ecology, threatened species ecology to genetics, what else? And the history of vegetation change. He's also, to my mind, one of the only people standing who has lasted the full distance of the Melbourne Strategic Assessment. And for that, we're profoundly thankful, because Steve's scientific rigour has done a great deal to make sure that the Melbourne Strategic Assessment stays on track despite all the absurdities that have accompanied it over the year. And the other thing to say about Steve is he's well, not big in Mongolia, but he's been out to Mongolia, and he's knows a lot about the Mongolian grasslands too, of which he is not going to speak to us tonight at all. So, Dr. Steve Sinclair, I'd like to hand it over to you. Just noting, people, put your questions in the chat, please. Probably feel free to interrupt Steve. No one ever does interrupt the speakers, but give it a go. Someday somebody will. Yeah, we'll just go from here. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Adrian, for that long introduction. I will just, of course, share my screen. Can you please tell me if you can see a slide in the display mode? Great. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I've been asked tonight to talk about what I'm calling the Forgotten Woodlands, which is basically about the ecology of trees on the Victorian volcanic plain. And I'm here, as Adrian mentioned, sort of with two hats on. One's the Rylah Institute, where I'm an ecologist, but also I'm a member in my private life of a community group called the Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands, and I will mention what they do at the end of the talk. All right. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people, and this is particularly important for this talk, because we're talking about history over sort of many hundreds of years. I'm trying to look back into the past. And so it's, like what for us is a kind of forensic effort of looking at, little bits and pieces in the really damaged landscape to try and piece together what's been going on in the past. Of course, Aboriginal people knew these areas well, they managed them. It's a great shame that we didn't have that knowledge transferred. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, but I'm going to be talking about and showing photos from across most of the Victorian volcanic plain. So I'll be talking about the ecology of Wadawurrung country, Bunurong country, and also Eastern Maar country. I'll start by saying that everyone here, I reckon, loves the big skies and the wide open grassy plains of the Victorian volcanic plains. So we all love our grasslands. And I think often when we're driving through the volcanic plains, and this is just a random street view image that's pretty typical, we tend to assume that the volcanic plains is treeless and that we're in a grasslands landscape. And indeed, if you look at the map of vegetation types, which the government has, sorry, that's a low resolution image, but it doesn't matter, you get the picture. All of that orange there is the ecological vegetation class, or EVC, that is plains grassland. And if you look up what that's meant to look like, you can read there under the word description, a treeless vegetation dominated by grasses, basically. So the other thing is that there's a fair bit of evidence that a lot of areas were completely treeless. So here's some very early sketches of the Werribee Plains, sort of around the Werribee River and Mount Cottrell from 1835, and there's not a tree in sight, just about. But that doesn't quite tell the whole story. So I'm going to talk to you today about the woody things that were out there. So the first point I'll make is that in the volcanic plains bioregion, which is the orange, green, and white bit, not all of it's orange. So don't forget the white bits. So the white bits are various other vegetation types, also the green bits, which are forest. But also don't assume that the orange areas, which are sort of ostensibly grassland, are completely treeless. So the boundaries between grasslands and savannas are pretty subtle. So sort of the tree grassland interface is a thing globally. So there's lots of places where you get grasslands blending into savannas and having boundaries with forests of all different kinds. This is an example from Central Asia. Interestingly enough, that grassland is dominated by stiper, elamis, and chloris, so some very familiar genera to us. But the point is, because this is a thing all over the world, there's a whole lot of literature about why you get this balance between grasses and trees, and why some places are treeless and some places have trees. So that's probably a good place to start here. So if you look at the literature, there's a bunch of reasons that might be relevant to the Victorian volcanic plains as to why some places are treeless, and I'll just sort of go through them. So the first one's drought stress. So that is the idea of it's usually where there's low rainfall, usually in summer, or, there's kind of like a crisis for plants. They can't extract enough water, so woody plants find it really hard to exist. And this is usually exacerbated by heavy clay soils, because the physics of extracting water from small particled soils is more difficult. So that's one reason. A second reason is competition from vigorous grass growth. So this probably doesn't bother big trees, but when we're talking about little seedlings, this can make a big difference and can control tree grass dynamics. And of course, fertile clay soils encourage grass growth in general, so that's relevant. There's also instances where you get waterlogging and inundation, and this can drown lots of woody species. Another thing is fire regimes. So some tree species can just be excluded by either very frequent and/or hot fires that will kill trees. There's also the issues of just cold and frost. So in the Asian example I showed you on the last slide, that one is very much about frost. And there's also browsing by animals. So in some cases, whether it's, I don't know, elephants or giraffes or something in Africa or whatever, animals can eat trees out. So if you think about the volcanic plains in Victoria, some of these things are more relevant than others. So clearly, I think drought stress is relevant here, and in the sense that much of the volcanic plains is clay soils, and much of it is in places with summer droughts. Vigorous grass growth, yep, that definitely applies. So we've got fertile soils, and we all know there's lots of grass out there. Potentially waterlogging. So we do have lots of sort of, blind valleys and lots of depressions in the lava plain, and you get inundation and waterlogging. Frequent fires. So yes, so this interacts with the vigorous grass growth. So if you've got lots of grass and you've got people who are managing the land, so we know there was fire in this landscape, so that's a potential candidate for contributing to these patterns. Frost, probably not really. I don't think so in the volcanic plain. That was very important. And browsing, not really sure. I don't think it was all that important. So those top four, I think, are mostly what's going on. The other thing to say, of course, is these factors overlap and interact. So it's never just one thing. These things feed off each other. But the point I'm making tonight is that there are many places where these factors are alleviated. So in that picture on the right, it's treeless grassland. There's something going on to exclude the trees, but there's lots of cases where there'll be something that allows trees to grow. And most of my talk tonight is going to be going through what those reasons might be and what kind of trees you might find. So, and by the way, all of those pictures and paintings are of the volcanic plains in Western Victoria. Another point is that because there's different reasons why those things are alleviated, be it the stoniness of the soil or something about the drainage patterns, you'll get different species in different places, so different species of trees, that is, and you get quite intricate patterns with different vegetation types. So we're not talking here about just like one species of tree and grasses. We're talking about a whole lot of different species of trees, each occupying different niches and forming patterns. The unfortunate thing from my point of view is that abuse of the landscape, so heavy clearing, cropping, etc., has obscured these patterns. So we're left now with a forensic problem where we've just got scant evidence, and we're trying to piece it together to try and understand how these landscapes worked in the past. And it's not always easy, and we don't really know in a lot of cases what's going on, and I don't claim to know much about this. So I'll try and string together a coherent story here. So how can we recover these patterns? So there's a few sort of lines of useful evidence. I'll go through them here. So the first one is relic trees, of course. So in lots of cases, we still have some trees remaining, and they give us very tangible clues. There's also early written testimony, so people's diaries, newspaper articles, books, etc., which can be really useful in descriptive terms. Early images as well, so paintings, drawings, and photographs. And I included a couple on that last slide there, but I will you'll see many of these sort of early images in the rest of the talk. Early maps as well, and I'll talk about them extensively. And as well, we can use those sort of first 4 dot points. We can extrapolate from them using modeling, and I'll give an example of that as well. So if we know about what's going on in a few places, we can potentially extrapolate across the landscape. I'll just introduce you, before I go any further, to some of the information that you can get from the historic maps. I think this is a really important resource. It's very powerful. So here's an example of the parish plan for the Dundonnell area. And you can see there, written diagonally across, it says stony rises, lightly timbered with lightwood, she oak, and honeysuckle. So across most of these parish plans, there are comments about the vegetation, and many of them mention trees. So in this case, lightwood is Acacia implexa, she oak will be either drooping she oak or bull oak, but in this case, drooping she oak, and honeysuckle refers to Banksia marginata. Often they don't mention trees, so there's a lot of cases where the comments will say treeless plains or clear of timber or open plains or something like this, that implies that the area was, back in the day, genuinely treeless. The other thing to recognise with these plans is there's a bit of bias here, because the idea of parish plans is to inform, potential settlers and buyers what they can get out of the land. So they've got a very agricultural perspective. So they're trying to tell people, who are kind of rubbing their hands together and saying, I want to put sheep on here, what the resources are. So they kind of got a resource focus. Another example, this is from over near Trawalla, so just east of Beaufort. So this comment, timbered chiefly with honeysuckle in different crab hole land of medium quality, and crab hole land refers to Gilgai Plains. Other things that they tell you are much more specific. So there are what we call corner post trees. So in a lot of the very early surveys, and this is particularly the case in the 1830s and 1840s, the lot corners, the surveyor would mark a tree physically, so they would blaze a tree, and that tree would be noted on the plan and exactly where it is. So this is a plan from just north of Melbourne, so in the Merry Creek catchment. So Donnybrook Road now runs along that horizontal axis, and the Hume Highway runs up the vertical axis there. And you can see the bit I've circled, that text says honeysuckle tree bearing south 0.35 links. So the links refers to the surveyor's chain, and the surveyor's chain is about the length of a cricket pitch, so 22 yards. And so that's telling us that within a very close margin of error, that corner had a honeysuckle tree, and this is and a lot of the plans have every single corner marked with a particular tree. So they also tell you when things are treeless. So often they'll say no tree near, marked with a can, marked with an earth mound, or marked with a stake. So from those kinds of bits of information, we can get lots of sort of mapped information, because there are parish plans available for much of the volcanic plains region. Here's just a bit of the work we did piecing this together. So this is just where various comments intersect what's ostensibly plains grassland. So the black dots are areas that were she oak woodlands, and the circles are Banksia woodlands. So you can see that they're quite extensive on places that are mapped as plains grassland. The other thing that they do is they give us some little kind of window into the association, so which species grew together. I wish there was more information on this, but at least with those comments, so for example, if I go back, this one here, there are 3 tree species mentioned together in the same phrase, so that sort of implies that those things were together in the same portion of the landscape. So you can have a look at, so this is where I've aggregated all of the comments across the volcanic plain, and this is for Banksia and she oak. So the top little table is when the word Banksia is mentioned, how often does it occur with nothing else? So it's just Banksia. How often is it with eucalypts, with blackwoods and lightwoods, etc.? So you can see that these things overlap in lots of complicated ways. There's lots of combinations. Sometimes things are on their own. Sometimes they're mixed with other things. There's lots of permutations. And there's a few examples of what these things might have looked like. So on the right there is a woodland of Banksia only on some stony rises out near Lake Goldsmith. Here's an example of eucalypts and Banksia, and here's an example of Banksia with acacia. And we can piece all of this together. So this is some work I did quite a long time ago, and I'm afraid it's pretty out of date now, but I don't have a more up-to-date version. But basically, all the red dots are Banksia records on the volcanic plains. These are aggregating all of the corner post records, the comment records, and existing trees. And from that, you can build models that extrapolate using terrain, rainfall, and so on. You can say, well, if we know that the Banksias occurred in the red spots, where else in the landscape is like those red spots? And we can also come at it in both directions. So in this case here, I did not only use the red dots, I also used places where we knew it was treeless. So there's lots of information about treelessness. So those two things work against each other to build the model. This is a draft. There's quite a few errors I'm aware of on this, so it needs improving, and don't look at it for too long. But we can do that kind of thing to sort of reconstruct these patterns. So now what I'll do is I'll take you through some of the kind of like terrain types on the volcanic plains, and I'll talk about what the evidence is for trees or not trees on those terrain types, and show you some images of what those things might have looked like. So I'll start with the parts of the landscape that are most certain. So stony rises, so these are like lava barriers that could be big and dramatic ones or sort of fairly subtle ones. There's heaps and heaps of evidence that these were very often treed, and that comes from multiple sources. So pretty much all sources. There are testimony, there's descriptions, there's photos, there's maps, etc., etc. And I think what's going on here is that basically the rockiness removes some of the drought stress associated with heavy clays. And there might also be some sort of micro issues to do with the way rainfall works. So there's sort of like the rocks kind of do a bit of mulching. They also help channel runoff. There's a whole lot of effects that happen on stony rises. The other thing potentially is that rocks offer a bit of fire protection to seedlings. The other thing to say here, of course, is that these terrain features occur across the volcanic plain, and so you can get like high rainfall examples and low rainfall examples, and you get different species of tree potentially occupying this niche where it's higher rainfall or lower rainfall. So for each of these examples, I'm going to give you kind of some examples of the two ends of the spectrum, but I'm really unsure about these because it's a bit hard to piece this all together. So there might be some things missing. I've had a little bit of a guess in some things, but in this case here, this one's reasonably good. So for higher rainfall areas, that we're talking here about like, what's some examples like over the west of the volcanic plain region, so like Camperdown, that kind of area. It's often manigum, blackwood, black wattle, cherry balat, and even some things that are perhaps a little bit surprising, but things like musk daisy bush, so things that you normally associate with wetter forests and stuff. As you move towards the eastern end of the plains, much lower rainfall, so you get more things like lightwood, drooping she oak, silver banksia, and sweet berseria. So some examples. So again, starting from the wetter ones, this is a basalt stony rise near Camperdown. It's basically a forest. So this is not, and this is still here. This is not really that surprising. This is the stony rises are well known to be treed. So there you can see the manigums, the blackwoods, cherry balat, and some daisy bush. Moving further east on the plain, so this is just north of Melbourne in Donnybrook. So here we've got red gums and acacias growing on stony rises. This is over near Portland, so these are drooping she oaks and acacias on stony rise. I'm assuming everyone can still hear me and see me. No one's, yeah, good. Thumbs up from Adrian, that's good. So here's an example of stony rise near, this is between Skipton and Beaufort. This is from the 1870s, so these are silver banksias growing on stony rise. Whoops, there we go. Interestingly enough, that's exactly the same stony rise as this painting. So that's kind of cool. So the painting, if you look closely, you can convince yourself that they are banksias, and the photo provides the direct evidence that they are banksias. Further towards the drier side of things, so on the Werribee Plains, I guess they're not really trees, they're probably more shrubs, but acacias, including Acacia paradoxa, hedge wattle. This is one where some people wonder whether this is perhaps invasive here. I don't really know. I think it's probably belongs there, but we may never know. And really dry areas, this is sort of near Ballyang on the Werribee Plains, sweet area growing on a small stony rise in amongst grassland. The other case where there's really strong evidence from lots of sources that we have trees on the volcanic cones. So I think most volcanic cones in Victoria were treed to some degree. Same thing that's going on for stony rises applies here, but also where you've got scoria cones, you've got really, loamy, gravelly, light kind of soils, and that removes the drought stress of the clay soils. So some examples here. So this is just a street view image from Mount Buninyong. So this is probably like one of the wetter examples of a volcanic cone. So in this case, you've got messmate, stringy bark, and manigum and blackwoods. Moving a bit drier, this is Mount Noorat. So in this case here, the crater's got blackwoods, black wattles, and silver banksia. This is a great photo. This is Mount Elephant in 1910. This is now completely treeless, but you can see in that photo, if you zoom in, it's actually quite a high res image. You can zoom right in and see most of that is drooping she oak. There's also some silver banksia and some black wattle. And there's Mount Shadwell at Mortlake. So in the background there, you can see, again, what's now a treeless volcano is covered in some kind of tree. I can't zoom in far enough to see what they are. I reckon they might be she oaks, but who knows? We'll never know, maybe. Okay, so now to some areas where the evidence is a bit more murky. So what I've called here undulating clay plains, and this is probably like most of the volcanic plains. This is where you've just got kind of, lava flows that are a bit undulating. There's some rocks strewn around. It's kind of like, most of the volcanic plains. There's patchy evidence from multiple sources across the whole volcanic plains that some of these areas were treed. This is often really unexpected to me. So I will occasionally come across a piece of evidence that there were trees somewhere where I would have, been really sure that it was treeless grassland, because that's kind of how it is today, and it's how I've kind of learnt about it. So this includes, places around the middle of grasslands in Melton and stuff. I guess this happens just where there's, rainfall sufficient to alleviate drought stress. The degree of rockiness is just sufficient to alleviate the clay soils. Again, some examples. So this is from Mount Cottrell. These are drooping she oaks. It's not a very good res photo, sorry, but that's Mount Cottrell in the background. It's looking north. Another example from Werribee of in this case, Bull Oak. Bull Oak again. So this is over in Western Victoria near Nerrin, silver banksias. I like this one because it's not a particularly kind of remarkable spot for the volcanic plains. It's, not particularly high relief, not particularly rocky. Any number of paddocks look like that, and there you have some big old banksias. I don't know why. Another old drawing from 1845 of the plains looking from Derrenellum to Mount Elephant. Slightly exaggerated, but you can see there heaps of trees. I guess, again, they're a mixture of she oak, wattle, and banksia. It's a bit hard to tell. Around Skipton, so this is west of Skipton on the old rail reserve. So some really large banksias, again, growing in a pretty nondescript part of the volcanic plains. So not even really rocky here. Back to Melbourne, so Donnybrook, of course, red gums. So red gums are a big deal on a lot of the volcanic plains, often with wattles like blackwood. Another example, this photo was taken today. The reason I was slightly late to this was because I was just uploading my photos. So this is at Ballyang, so Bull Oaks on volcanic terrain. And this site here is sort of sloping upwards from where I'm standing to a stony rise. It's definitely basalt. There's lots of basalt floaters and boulders everywhere. What's interesting about this site is I noticed this fallen bullock that pulled up a whole lot of soil from underneath its roots, and there's a whole lot of buckshot in the soil. And that's kind of interesting because that's perhaps not what we normally expect to see in the surface soils of the volcanic plains. This suggests that there's a bit more going on than what I'm saying. So I'm just saying, oh yeah, it's about rockiness and rainfall. There's a whole lot of subtle things about the soil formation that can involve, like, wind-blown layers going over the top of the basalt, water percolating, in this case, precipitating iron nodules and so on. So I think that without a whole lot of really close investigation of what's going on at the soil locally, it can be a bit hard to generalize, particularly when you just got kind of undulating plains. So now I'll move on to where you've got like really obvious cases of of other soil on top of the basalt. So often you'll get like either washes or blows of sand or gravel on top of the basalt. So here we've got good evidence, it's a bit patchy, but from multiple sources. And in this case, the reason why trees like it is because there's basically a surface layer on top of the heavy clays that alleviates the drought problems, and seedlings don't mind germinating there, so there'll be sand or gravel on top. So Ainsbury Forest, so just west of the Werribee River, is an example of this. So that's got a gravelly layer on top of the basalt. And of course, it's a grey box forest. Inverleigh Common, I'm actually not entirely sure if there's, so the Inverleigh Common is like wind-blown sands. I'm actually not sure whether it's all over basalt or whether that's another terrain underneath. I put it in this category for the moment, but here you can see Manigum, black wattle and banksia growing there. Similar situation at Teesdale, so north of Teesdale, again, Manigum and banksia. And you'll also get areas where there's just bits of landscape that have nothing to do with the volcanic plain that just stick through a little bit. In other words, the lava's kind of basically gone around them. So this is often like granites that stick up, or bits of sedimentary rock that stick up, and the basalt plain flows around them. But they're often really subtle. So often you might just think you're on the basalt plain, but you're not quite. So here's an example of one of my favorite photos from near Lismore. So this is looking over a creek where the viewer is standing on sort of a chunk of granodiorite. So that's like granite that's sticking up, and then in the background is the volcanic plain, and there's actually kind of like a boundary just in that little valley there. And here you can see that these huge banksias and blackwoods are growing on the granodiorite. Whether there were trees out here, I don't know, but this is Mount Elephant. You can just see faintly outlined in the background there, and that previous illustration that I showed you suggested that volcanic plain also had trees on it. Another example, Durdawarra. So this is sedimentary terrain that's kind of right up against volcanic terrain. So only, I don't know, half a kilometre from where I took this photo, you're stepping out onto basalt boulders in the paddocks. But it's a pretty subtle transition. You wouldn't really know. But in this case, it's sedimentary terrain, and here you've got, a whole lot of gums, and in this case, cherry balat. Wetlands and Gilgai Plains. So again, there's patchy evidence about what's going on here. In some cases, it's really clear that you've got trees. In other places, it's a bit less clear. Some of the species here, river red gum and swamp gum, are particularly big players. And these areas are often sharply delineated from what's going on around them. So the previous few examples where it's about sort of fairly subtle soil changes, it's often really hard to understand what the boundaries are doing. But here it's often pretty obvious where the kind of inundation or the wetland ends. A few examples here. So this is an example from Balyang. You can see here, well, it's a full-on wetland where Damien was standing. We took this photo, but in the background you can see big old red gums. And around this area, it's probably treeless grassland. So the red gums are hanging on to this spot because it gets enough water. Another example of a red gum wetland on the Werribee Plains. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is swamp scrubs. So in Western Victoria, so sort of from, I don't know, Colac west mostly, tea tree scrubs were a really, really big deal on the volcanic plains, and these could often be quite large trees. So we're talking sort of 3, 4, 5 meters tall, and where you got kind of, waterlogged clays in valleys and things, you would get tea tree scrubs. So in this case here, I'm standing on a stony rise. This is a basalt stony rise. There's actually lava tunnels underneath where I'm standing. And then you're looking at just a low point in the landscape. And so the lowest point is filled with reeds. But around the margins of that, you've got a really well-developed tea tree scrub and some blackwood sticking out of it. Another example of red gums growing in a bit of a wet spot. In the really dry parts of the plains, this is near Melton, where you've got a little depression, you'll often get lignum, which is the tangled stuff in the bottom there, with grey box. And in this case here, I'm pretty sure that the plains around that were treeless grassland, just a little pocket of grey box with lignum. What I was going to say here. So this is just some work we did a while ago to try and sort of pull multiple sources of evidence together. So here I've got, again, it's a bit low resolution, sorry, but the crosses represent places where the earliest records that we have suggest the land was treeless, grassland, and the various blobs and circles and things represent various species of tree that are coming both from contemporary observations and historic observations. And the line work is where the parish plans actually show boundaries. So in this case, forest boundaries. And this is around Ainsbury. So if I add what you can now see is the Western Grassland Reserve boundary on there. This is the Werribee River. This, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the cross that's sort of the middle of the three crosses is Mount Cottrell. And the black areas there are the grey box woodlands of Ainsbury, Pinkerton Forest, and sort of up near Parwin. So we can do some quite detailed reconstructions, and there's a few things that you can sort of see sort of functionally about the landscape. So one example here is that photo is taken right there, and that little patch of she oak woodland that conveniently appears on the parish plan is the patch that's in that photo, which I kind of like. You can see some functional things. So in this case here, we know that there are bands of gravel that have been washed from the Rowsley Fault, which is just out of the top of the screen when that went up, and the Port Phillip region kind of went comparatively downwards. A lot of gravel washed onto the volcanic plain from the Rowsley Fault down the kind of depression where the Werribee River flows, and that explains why the Ainsbury Forest and the Pinkerton Forest extend as sort of tongues along either side of the Werribee. So there's various kind of geomorphological reasons why these patterns occur. Similarly, these woodlands of bull oak, she oak, and honeysuckle are about the gravel from the granites of the Yuyangs being washed or blown onto the volcanic plains nearby. I'll just quickly mention some less common species. I've sort of quickly gone through all the main things, but some of the perhaps more interesting ones. So snow gum is patchy but common in a few places. So there's a photo of a snow gum on a stony rise from Timdonbrain near Ballarat. Red box. So on the Werribee Plains, there are some areas of a few hundred hectares that we know used to be red box woodlands. There's only about 3 trees remaining, including this cracker. Photo from John O. Wilson. And again, you can see that's a very typical basalt stony rise, and it's kind of surprising to come across a stonking big red box on it. But there you go. Moona. So this is out near Little River, middle of a paddock, a couple of old Moona trees. I slightly suspect that these were planted, but then again, I can't quite imagine why someone would plant Moona trees in the middle of a paddock. So maybe they're remnant, but there are certainly old records of Moona trees on the volcanics.
Okay, for sheep.
So I'll stop going through examples. Hopefully that didn't prove too boring, and just talk briefly about what we know sort of across a timeline and what happened here. So I prepared these slides for a talk that I was giving specifically on silver banksia, so it's a bit banksia focused, but I think it will do the trick. So on the top of this timeline, I'm talking about kind of the evidence for there being, in this case, banksia trees in the volcanic plains and when we've got that evidence for. So the first thing is between about the 1830s and about 1870, banksias commonly appear on survey plans, so that's pretty standard. In fact, those blue bars are like a histogram of how many times they appear. They don't really appear much after 1870. Then we've got some comments. So we've got a comment from the 1850s saying that banksia trees particularly affect the volcanic soil. So this person was talking about the Malort Plains near Smeaton, but they were basically saying banksias characterize the volcanic plains in their view, which is kind of interesting. Then we've got a couple of railway lines that were built across what was already squatting and farming land, and so they're kind of like transects that just sample the agricultural landscape. And both the Ballarat Geelong Railway and the Ballarat Skipton and Hamilton Warrnambool Railway lines, which were built in the late 1850s and the 1880s, intersect heaps of trees. So there must have been trees in that landscape when these sort of transects went through that were the railway lines, including a lot of banksias. So we know they were still in the landscape in the 1880s. But there's pretty much no evidence of them after 1900. So they're kind of gone. Then we've got some comments about them being kind of in trouble. So the earliest comment I can find of Banksias declining is from around Colac, where someone wrote that the landscape was timbered with lightwood and honeysuckle, most of which are now dead, which is interesting. In the 1880s, comment, the forests have almost disappeared. The honeysuckles have vanished root and branch. Again, after 1900, a comment from around Hamilton saying a thick forest of which scarcely one tree remains. And then Jim Willis's comment from the no, sorry, it's not Jim Willis, it's someone else. Anyway, that the Proteaceae are wholly absent from the volcanic plains around Melbourne. So you can see that this sort of gives us a rough idea that these things were common back at invasion and kind of petered out by 1900, and they were starting to get into trouble pretty early on. Some of the things that were happening here. So the first thing that happened was squatter pastoralism. So this is basically sheep. So I think the first impact is sheep eating seedlings, and this is particularly the case for Banksias and she oaks. But also a lot of big, hot, inappropriate fires happened at this point in time. So it's possible that some of these things, like in the 1850s, where we're talking about a landscape of trees that are mostly dead, was about the big fires. And I gave a similar talk to this for the Friends of Merri Creek Management Committee, and there were some useful comments that pointed that fact out to me. The next perhaps big thing that happened was things like rabbits. So again, eating out the seedlings. That happened in the late 1850s. And then from the sort of well, this is over a long period of time, but the after the gold rush from the 1860s, but particularly the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, massive intensification of agriculture. So this is both about closer settlement because of squatting runs being opened up to private ownership after the gold rush, but also the advent of superphosphate, which was subsidised, which really took off sort of roughly around 1900. So I think we had a whole huge amount of impacts here. We had much more clearing, so clearing for firewood, clearing just to open up pasture, as well as superphosphate potentially damaging things like Banksia that don't necessarily love high P levels. So I guess the point here is that it's not hard to think about why the trees have disappeared. There's like heaps of reasons. It's perhaps more surprising that any still exist. There's probably more reasons that I could go into than those ones as well, but they're perhaps the main things. I'll briefly talk about what we've lost. So we haven't just lost some trees. The point here is that we've lost like whole ecosystems and beautiful landscapes. So these woodlands or savannas or forests or whatever you want to call them would have been full of resources. So these are resources for people in terms of shade, wood, nectar, etc. Also for animals, of course. So I've got a couple of photos there showing just some examples of how big these things could be. So on the left is me standing next to a big Banksia tree. So that's a silver Banksia with a breast height diameter of 2 meters. But the point I want to make there is that it's full of hollows. So we don't often think about Banksias as being hollow bearing, but you can see above my head is a hollow and a spout, and that tree is loaded with hollows. Similarly, on the right, there's a picture of one of our audience members today, Jeff. Hi, Jeff. That's you, Jeff, standing in front of a really large old drooping she oak. Again, that she oak was full of hollows. So we lost a huge resource of hollows. Combined with nectar, I think you can imagine a whole lot of things like sugar gliders, pygmy possums, etc., probably being extensive across the plains if you've got hollows and nectar and seeds and so on. So obviously there's also the resources of, like I mentioned, nectar and seeds. And this applies, again, this was from a talk about Banksia, but this also applies very much to she oaks and of course to eucalypts as well. So what can we do about this? I'm nearly finished. So I'm going to try and end on an optimistic note. I mean, the first thing we can do, of course, is protect what we've got left. So I think trees that are relic trees in the volcanic plains are really, really important ecologically, but also historically to remind us what we've lost. We can also try our best to learn about the lost ecology. So trying to understand some of the things that I've touched on today, I'm not very sure about. I'd love to learn more about it. There's a whole lot of ways we can find out more. That'd be great to do that. But we can also restore these landscapes to some degree, and this is where the Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands come in. So the Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands are a community group. It's about 80 members and growing. it's particularly focused around Western Victoria, but it's also got a presence across right across to Melbourne. It's made up of mostly landowners, which is really great, but also scientists, students, anybody really. And we've done a whole lot of work investigating these historic patterns. So a lot of the work that I've presented tonight has been done through the Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands in our attempts to try and understand how these systems used to be and how they used to function. We've also done a bit of work on Banksia genetics, and we're just launching into Bursaria genetics to try and work out, um, are these things suffering from inbreeding? Are they different one place to another? And that kind of information can help work out what's the best way to put things back together again. But the main task that the Friends have done is collecting seeds from many, many locations. So for Banksia, it's over 50 locations, growing them using both nurseries through funding, but also volunteers growing them at home. And so far, we've planted about 38,000 Banksias, plus, again, this was from a Banksia talk, but plus a whole lot of drooping she oaks and Bursarias in 32 seed production areas and counting. And these are mostly on private farms. And you can see in that photo there, Bill Weatherly on the left and Aggie Stevenson from Glenelg Hopkins CMA. So they're two really massive contributors. So our president and treasurer there doing some growing. And I think, the other thing to say here is that restoring woody species is like a way more optimistic task than restoring the grassy layer. So as probably everyone here knows, restoring the grassy layer is full of frustrations and backward steps and weed problems and so on. Planting trees is way easier. So this is like actually an optimistic kind of place to end, in the sense that we can do this. It's not impossible. I'll stop there. So yeah, I'll take questions. Thank you for listening. And in fact, I might stop. Well, no, maybe I'll leave my screen up in case I need to go back to the slides. So thanks.
Well, thank you for speaking, Steve. That's well, for me, that was incredibly eye-opening. I had really no idea of that, the extent of that rich mosaic that's across all of that area. People do put your questions in the chat, but maybe I should.
I haven't been looking at the chat. I can open it now and look at it if you want me to, or would you rather
Yeah,
for your
sure.
questions?
Go ahead. There aren't any questions per se in
Okay, well you can. Yeah.
yet, but I'm sure there's about to be. Vanessa Craigie has her hand up. Vanessa, speak.
Sorry,
Hi, Vanessa.
that was sort of rude because I'm jumping in ahead of the people on the chat, so I do apologise for that. Steve, right. I'm interested in that, given the patchiness of the fires that we know that's all across the plains. Once you actually get some tree, well, at least a big tree established, do you actually think you might get a microclimate sort of an event that means that may allow other trees, other smaller trees to establish, or at least saplings to come in?
I think yes. So if you think about drooping she oaks, they're a classic example of, if you look at a mature drooping she oak, underneath it is usually like a really dense bed of needles, and often some chenopod's and often not many grasses. Similarly, under grey box, suck out the water and you get really sparse areas of grass. So I think in answer to the question about are there kind of microclimates forming around trees, I think definitely yes. Exactly what their impacts are, I don't really know. I mean, I think they would affect fire behavior. So I think in some cases they'll prevent fire from burning the tree. In other cases they might burn. I don't really know all the kind of examples. Whether they promote seedling recruitment, they may well. I mean, there could be a feedback. If grass is suppressed, there could easily be a feedback with seedlings finding it a bit easier to grow on the margins where there's less grass competition. So that's quite possible. It's hard to say because we just don't see much recruitment in these kind of landscapes now because of livestock and rabbits. It's kind of a hard thing to study. But I think the answer is yes, but I don't really know all the details.
Because the classic thing is going up to Mount Ridley, quite a few years ago, when there'd been a really huge recruitment event. You could barely fight your way through the sea of red gum saplings without a machete.
Yeah.
They'd absolutely gone bananas. So once they get a chance, Yeah, that becomes really interesting to how self-generating it is. So I guess that's the question about the patchiness. It doesn't matter if something hanging in there that means that something is maintained, or is it much more complex? Probably the latter.
I think it's really complicated because it's the interaction of the soils, the fire that's being applied, and the kind of feedbacks that you're talking about that the trees themselves create. And I think the example you're talking about at Mount Ridley is an example where there's like been a huge kind of jolt to the system where like it's been mostly cleared with a few trees left, flogged with livestock for ages, and then the livestock suddenly removed and you get a massive recruitment event. I kind of doubt that sort of thing happened on that scale. 300 years ago, I think things were much more subtle.
Just showed the opportunities. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. That was brilliant.
Thanks,
A
Vanessa.
couple of questions in the chat before we get to John. Alison Tees asks, what is the importance of genetics with Banksia seed collection?
Oh, okay. So that was work that Adam Miller from DEECA led, not me, but it was part of the Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands. There is a paper on Banksia genetics. So basically we looked at the small remnant Banksia stands across Western Victoria on the plains. So we didn't look at the big areas like the Grampians and the Otways and stuff. We're looking at the plains where it's all been fragmented. The main lessons from that story were that there were no really clear geographic sort of divisions or strong patterns. So it wasn't like the ones at one end of the plain were really different from the ones at the other end of the plain, and there was no kind of obvious boundaries. The other thing was that because they're fairly long-lived trees, there wasn't severe inbreeding yet, but the signs weren't good. So the interpretation from those two bits of evidence are that mixing is probably the right thing to do, and that sort of fits in with the idea that these things used to be really widespread and their genes are probably spread by nectar-feeding birds. So the conclusion is that some mixing between provenances is a good idea. And so what we've been doing with the seed production areas is mixing. So we've mixed widely in those seed production areas.
Okay, interesting. There's a Judy Pierce asks, how does the tree violet, Melictius dentatus, help in protecting young tree growth?
That's a great question. I don't really know in terms of how big the effect size is, but I can only imagine that it would, in the sense that it's prickly and dense. So I don't have much more insight than that, but I suspect it probably does. That's all I can say. That's a good point.
Very good. John Dill Pratt.
Hi, Steve. Thanks very much for that. It was terrific. Steve, the fact that the stony rises are so heavily treated at times, or all treated at times, does that suggest to you that they're relics from a time when the plains were more heavily treed, or is there something else going on, do you think? I've got a couple of other questions for you, if you don't mind.
I don't know the answer to that one. I mean, I think if you look into the pollen record, which I'm not really an expert on, but my memory of that research is that there used to be more pollen coming from drooping she oaks and things like that across the plains, sort of as you go back into deep time. So I think that the plains have become more open and grassy over sort of tens of thousands of years, but I'm not really sure. You probably need to talk to a palynologist about that. But I think that these things are dispersible. So like, most seed from she oaks and banksias and bursarias and things will fall locally, but I mean, cockatoos will carry cones around. A heavy wind will take a she oak seed. It's got a little wing. So I think that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the remnants of contraction. I think that stony rises could also be colonized. So I think there's probably complicated dynamics going on where some things are contracting, some things are expanding. I don't think it necessarily means that they've contracted to the rises.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
You've answered the other question, one of the questions about the pollen cores, and yes, probably find someone else to talk about that. But yes, I was wondering if the pollen cores were informative there.
They are. I just don't really know the details, but my memory of them is that there used to be a heck of a lot more she oak, and that's declined over tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, sure. My more a comment, but where we restore from scratch, direct sowing and all that sort of stuff that we do, we do get very good Thermida grassland within a decade or so, and quite complex in some places. But one of our problems is too many trees. And if you've got a dispersing, particularly eucalypts, we don't have any sites where we've got dispersing she oaks and banksias, and they'd be much more susceptible to grazing anyway, I suspect. But something that happens when the grass competition is low during the early establishment, that we get a massive tree seedlings, and it seems a great opportunity to actually re-establish large areas of established grassland with eucalypts, which are with a range of species which are establishing by themselves, not from tube stock. If you can add seed to that that system while it's still relatively immature, the trees do get a go on and get ahead of the grasses, and then they are probably well established, I suspect. But they're actually quite weedy in our restorations at times.
Yes, and I've just gone back a few slides, so that all makes sense to me. Thanks, John. But I've just gone back. I don't want to overcook the tree story here. I've gone back to this slide because I wanted to remind people that the crosses are where, at least at the point of invasion in 1835, there's evidence that it was completely treeless, right? So I don't want to overcook the tree idea and suggest that trees belong everywhere and this is all the woodland and grasslands are a fiction. I'm certainly not saying that. And I certainly agree that there are places where you don't want trees if you're trying to restore open grassy plains. There's lots of ecological reasons why you don't want trees as well. So yeah, don't read this as saying that I'm sort of pro-tree and anti-grassland in any way.
No, I certainly wasn't suggesting that. I just think that there are opportunities to start these whole systems from scratch again.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of that sort of technology available now, but we just need land and resources to do it. And look, it's artificial, but it's at least maintaining the species and the combinations that. I'm not suggesting that they represent exactly what used to be there, but they're possible. Thanks, Steve.
Those stony rises are often sources of remnant native herbs.
Sorry, I missed that.
Those stony rises that you were talking about earlier are often a source of indigenous remnant indigenous herbs.
Absolutely.
I've spent a lot of time spraying out on the what is it, Galata Tambora from the ring road up to Craigieburn East Road. And when we've been spraying out there, there's been quite a few of the stony rises with remnant herbs on it, such as what is it, that fern that grows on the grassy plains? I forget the signs.
Rock fern, probably.
The fern. There was quite a lot of that fern.
Rock fern. I think you probably mean Calanthes.
I can't remember.
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't mention about stony rises, which you're quite right, they're often a really rich source of lots of species of grasses and herbs, is because they're often the only bits of the landscape that are not cropped. So in a landscape like what's on my questions slide there, often the flat lowlands are physically disturbed by ploughing, whereas the stony rises, it's impossible to do that. So they're often the last bits where things hang on for that reason. And also you can't drive on them often, so it's harder to.
Also cemeteries and along railway lines are often good sources of remnant.
Yep. So a lot of the evidence I presented for when I showed that map with the red dots, where the banks is, where a lot of those are in cemeteries and railway lines. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Fantastic. Andrew Arnold, do you have a question?
Yes. A double barrel one. Firstly, Steve, you haven't mentioned Melacistus, the tree violet.
Yep.
And there's a couple of forms of that. There's the dentatus, and there's also the Angustifolius divercatus, I think it is.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and that one is in some of the older basalt areas, and I'm thinking of places like Mount Greenock, near Talbot, that area. Yep. So I wondered if you'd looked at that species. And the other question that I have for you is, have you, in assembling your collection, wonderful collection of photographs, picked up on the major fires and post-fire in areas that were affected by, for instance, the 1944 fires, which are huge across the Western Plains, some around, particularly around the area around the Yuyangs, 1967, and then 1977, there were some very extensive fires, and also in the far west area in 1983. So whether you've been able to accumulate some photographs which might indicate the impact on trees that followed those big fires.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Andy. Good to see you too, by the way. I'll do the second question first because it's easy, and basically the answer is no. I don't have photographic evidence of the impacts of those fires, but I haven't specifically looked for that. Then it may be a case of going to Trove or something and actually searching for fire impacts rather than the search terms that I used. But I can't think of any of the photos that I've got in my collection addressing that issue directly. The first question, I should have mentioned tree violets. I don't quite know why I didn't. I think I didn't because they're still really common and they're perhaps less surprising to us, but also because I was focusing more on the bigger trees. So I didn't mention, because I mean they're often sort of, small trees at the most, or shrubs. But yeah, look, they're really common, particularly on stony rises right across the volcanic plain, from the dry Werribee plains right through to the wetter parts, particularly around like Lake Corangamite, around Dreeite and Biak and Red Rock and stuff. There's some vast landscapes covered in tree violet.
They're probably less specific to the basalt areas too. They tend to have a broader range of growing conditions.
They do, but most of these things I've been talking about do. So like drooping she oak, bull oak, banksia, all the eucalypts, none of these things are restricted to the volcanic plains. I probably should have made that point. So none of these things are restricted to the volcanic plains at all. They're all things that are coming from elsewhere and finding a home on the plains.
We have no grassland specific trees, Steve.
Not trees, no.
That's sad. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. And your talk was absolutely fantastic. I was riveted. It was really good.
Thanks, Andy. Good.
Is there any cultural burning going on in Plenty Gorge?
I don't know.
Okay, we did have a burning question, another burning question. Sorry, the role and influence of Indigenous. Sorry, it's not a burning question at all. Alison Tees asks if do you know what the role and influence of Indigenous management on the volcanic plain was, perhaps with respect to the trees and so on. Like you mentioned, their resources and so on, but I'm actually deeply ignorant of this matter. I know what stuff about the plains, but
I think I'm probably ignorant as well. I think probably most people are, because it's something that's unfortunately, not come down to us in detail. I mean, I think what I can say is there's really early evidence of burning. So I think it's probably pretty obvious that First Nations people were using fire on these landscapes. So one of the earliest of all references was from 1803 when Flinders landed in Port Phillip Bay and walked up to Station Peak in the Yuyangs. He mentions the amount of fire that they walked on, fire grounds going from the coast to the Yuyangs, and also from looking out across the plains, saying that it was extensively blackened. So there's a really early reference of fire being used. So I think there's no question that people were burning the plains, and that's pretty obvious. The problem is I don't think we, or at least I don't know all the details of season, regime, size, intensity, all those things I'd love to know. I don't know. So my view would be that fire would have shaped some of these patterns. So, some of these species are pretty fire sensitive. Like most of them can resprout from fire, but things like, a big old she oak or a big old banksia doesn't love it. So they'll often resprout weakly. So I think you can potentially push some things out with fire, but I think that I think that the use of fire is about reinforcing the patterns that are there naturally. So for example, if you've got a grassy landscape with savanna, forest and woodland sort of patches all over it, I think you can use fire to manipulate that, but you wouldn't probably go to the wet forest of Macedon and create a grassland there. So there's kind of like, there are limits that are based on the soil and the climate, but within those limits, I think you can do a lot with fire.
What about sorry, Steve, what about other other effects of First Nations management? So not fire, but do you have any evidence of like cultivation of trees or I don't know.
I don't have any evidence of that, but it's perfectly possible. I mean, I just don't know. I'd love to know. I mean, and, you know, some of these things, like I said, provide really important resources. Like, you know, like we know people use Banksia nectar, for example. So, did people plant Banksias? They may have. I don't know. Yeah, and I mean,
Beth Gott had quite a bit to say about what she thought was going on with, you know, sort of the quasi-agriculture and also the burning regimes. But I don't know how much in detail she published. I mean, you'd have probably looked at all this, anything that she popped up with, I guess, Steve.
Yep. And I used to have an office near Beth's, but
exactly.
she's sadly gone. Yeah.
I'm afraid so, but she had so much to say.
That's right.
And
yeah.
I don't think she wrote it all down.
I think you're right.
No,
Yeah.
she was a fierce Scrabble player. So, all right. Kath Rawlings asks if you went back to the surveyor's notebooks that are in the PROV, which I presume is the Public
Records Office.
Because they
yes.
have finer scale stuff, perhaps.
So a little bit. Yes, I did a little. Oh, my screen's gone blank. Why is that? Not sure why. Anyway, I did, but not extensively. There's still way more for me to explore there. So, for example, that I showed a picture early on of the sketches from 1835. So they come from a notebook that was in, I forget where that might have been the State Library of Victoria. So I have dipped into that a little bit, but I'm aware there's a lot more information there that I haven't yet gone through. It's a lot of work to go through it all, and this is a love project, not a funded project. So it's very slow moving. But yeah, good suggestion.
Fair enough. Deb Reynolds, you have your hand up.
Yes. I had a couple of questions. Where should we source plants from? That's a big question. You know, where should I go get my Banksias from? Who's growing them? Who's the best people to get them off?
Melbourne Wildlife Sanctuary Nursery at La Trobe University.
Okay, Steve.
Well, I mean, I'm very biased because I would say the Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands. So they do give out plants for free, and so, but they don't do all the species. So they're growing Banksia, Berseria, drooping she oak mostly are the three that they're really focusing on. And for those ones, there's a lot of consideration given to provenancing, mixing.
Okay, cool.
So, you know, where the group thinks mixing is good, mixing is happening. Where we think, you know, local provenancing is good, etc. So that, but I mean, there are other nurseries that are growing plants for the volcanic plains. Greg just mentioned one, but there's
just
also
good to know. Yeah.
You know, yeah, there's quite a few growers around.
Also,
Yep.
Also Vink in Fairfield.
Yep, Vink has relevant things,
and I mean, I also think that, you know, the volcanic plains were managed as a food bowl by Indigenous people, I'm sure of, and I reckon a lot of the rocky rises might not have burnt too, because some of them, certainly where I am, they're huge. The grassland fires would have gone around them. They wouldn't have even gone over them, maybe. And also a woodland would have been, the trees were big. A lot of the trees were big and old, so the fire might have just gone straight under them. I reckon some of those Banksias, those big trees too. That's my guess. But yeah, I know that a lot of the Indigenous people don't actually really know, unfortunately.
Did you have a second question, Deb?
No, that was it. I was just going to comment on that slightly and just ask about Banksia. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries at all. What else? Other questions, people? Come on, we can't keep. We're only 7:39.
It's a comment more than a question, but you can get native grasses and some of the herbs to re-establish. I kind of did it on a really small scale in my former garden in 56 Derby Drive. That somebody else moved in and obliterated it, but it's a matter of kind of going heavy on the herbicides to wipe out the as much of the weedy species, including the seed bank in the soil, for a couple of years, and then you start planting the native stuff and deliberately spreading the seeds. And if you keep doing it, you build up a bit of a momentum, and then they just kind of take over. But you can only do it on small scales, and particularly if you're doing that in a grassland, it's pretty labour intensive for quite a few years.
Certainly, very true. Steve, can you what implications does this research have for like the restoration of the Western grassland reserves? Because speaking of a lot of weed spraying, is there a focus at all on restoring tree species? I know we've had lots of management discussions where we talked about using trees as windbreaks and using stony rises as like wayfinding places across the landscape for future people who are walking through the reserves and so on. Has any of that, any tree stuff hit the ground?
A little bit. So I was flicking through my slides there to get to this slide. So this is, as I mentioned before, done specifically for the Western Grassland Reserve. So, I mean, I guess the first point I'd make is that as far as we know, if you flip between those two, you can see most of the Western Grassland Reserve is, you know, at the point of invasion treeless. So I don't think that trees are going to happen on the kind of the thousands of hectares scale. We have done a little bit of planting of trees. There's been a bunch of she oak, lightwood, and eucalypt plantings dating back to 2015. Most of them you can't see very easily, but if you drive down Cobbledix Ford Road and look to the west, you'll see lightwoods and she oaks starting to be visible on the stony rises there. That's the result of planting. And there's also bull oaks starting to appear in that paddock. They're very slow, so they were planted 10 years ago now, and they're only head high. There's also been, we planted many hundreds of Banksias, and they all died in a hot summer, but we'll do more.
Okay. John Del Pratt, you had your hand up momentarily, but you pulled it down again. Is that for you?
Because you stole my thunder, mate. That's why.
Oh.
I mean, what are you doing here? Yeah, anyway, Steve, yeah, it was more a matter of to what extent we've mapped. I know there's been a lot of mapping, vegetation mapping on the Western Grassland Reserve, and to what extent have trees come up on that mapping. But you've more or less answered that question, I think. But we've still got the opportunity on the Western Grassland Reserve to do a bit of imaginative stuff as well. I don't think we have to be, you know, if we find areas that are suited to, you know, suited to the various tree species, I'm not sure that we can't be a bit creative there.
For sure. So just this year, just this season, we've been surveying a new property, and we found I think 29 big stumps of what we believe was a red box on the stony rises there, which kind of, you know, redraws the kind of ecological thinking for that property. So there's a case where, you know, we may well decide to plant a woodland of red box back on that property. Yeah, and it's very near that big red box tree I showed you. It's kind of the next property along from that. So we're still discovering new things, I think.
All right. Does anyone else have any final comments?
I think Debbie's got her hand up.
Oh, Debbie again. Yes.
Sorry. Well, we've got there's a huge stump on you know, the Cherry Creek property. It's very old and it's dead, but it's in a spot that was it's a low-lying area. How can we find out what it is, what it was? Is there any way of doing that?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, there's two. Well, you can look at the wood. So things like, I mean, Banksia wood, she oak wood, very different to eucalypt wood, because of the ray structure. So
I reckon it's a
eucalypt.
That's my guess. I reckon.
I mean, I'm not great at it, but someone who's into their timbers. So we'd cut little bits off what we thought were red box and took them back to people who know woods better, and they said, yes, that looks like red box, just through the color and the density of the wood. So I'd suggest getting someone
very old.
who knows to look at it. If it's in a depression and it's near Cherry Creek, it's probably a red gum, though, I'd say.
Yeah, that's what I reckon. I'm assuming it. Yeah.
University of Melbourne, Creswick Campus Library has the most amazing collection of timber samples, a big thing that covers half the wall in the library, and you can go and look at the grains of the timber. And it's unique. I haven't seen anything quite like it anywhere else, but that's at Melbourne University campus, Creswick campus, in the old library there, which was the old hospital.
Fantastic, Andy.
Thanks,
I didn't know about that. I've actually got some of those old tiles with the labels on them.
Yes.
They must be from a similar thing. They're from like
Well,
100 years ago, but I didn't know about the full wall.
Quite an amazing collection. And I think if you contacted the library or the Creswick campus, you would be able to get access to it. I think that the library's open. It's very infrequent, but I think once a week or something like that. I'm not quite sure. But yes, you can actually go there and have a look.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, Deb Baines, you want to ask a question, but you can't find the button. Talk to us, Deb, please.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Steve, for a really interesting conversation. So I'm a landowner with grassland, and this is more I don't know, a comment or something, I suppose. So at the moment, as farmers, we ourselves try to do a lot around biodiversity and grassland conservation. And then we have the other side of things where we're trying to find some money to to enable ourselves to do that. And of course, at the moment, that money is coming through the carbon game. Unfortunately, what we're finding is that anyone in the carbon game is only interested in planting a heap of trees in a high density and don't care about, you know, they want them to be native, but not necessarily province, what would the word be, of the right provenance. And we can't find any organization that's interested in looking at the carbon sequestration of grasslands. We can't find anyone who sees the biodiversity of the grasslands not equating to tree plantations in the traditional sense of the word. And as somebody who's very devoted to their grasslands, and I know there's neighbors around us that are the same, it's a really big frustration for us.
So Steve, do you have any, grassland sequestration? What have you got?
And we are recipients of Forgotten Grasslands too. Thanks, Steve.
Great. Good. I don't know anything about the carbon sequestration abilities of grassland. Sorry, it's not my thing. And I agree that, you know, planting high densities of trees across grasslands for, you know, getting carbon quickly is, you know, usually not the right thing to do ecologically. So I think I basically disagree with you. The one thing I'd say is that, you know, if there was any of these systems that lend themselves to dense, quick plantings, you know, perhaps it's things like the grey box forests to the east of the plain, or the, you know, the sort of manigums and messmates to the west of the plain. But, you know, by and large, I think it's a different game.
Yeah, I think we'd be considered almost more of the treeless.
Yeah,
so we're in that skipped area.
I don't really have a good answer to that.
It's one of those government policy things, a bit like the old tree clearing one way back when, that's going to cause all sorts of problems for the environment while pretending to do something that's supposed to be good.
Deb, I'm pretty sure, it's John Delprat, I'm pretty sure that the people are studying carbon sequestration in grasslands. It's a very dynamic thing, and it's a pretty dangerous, you know, it's not easy to measure these things, I believe, but there will be scientific papers out there that are investigating that particular issue. Whereabouts are you, Deb?
We're in the Skipton Beaufort area.
Oh yeah, okay, just up the road from us. All right.
Buckyard Hill, yeah.
Yeah. I'm not fully conversant myself, but I know that it's often spoken about as a carbon sequestration source, but measuring it and being funded for it is a pretty lively sort of debate, that one.
Yeah, you're not wrong. But I think it's more to, you know, anybody who might be on this call who's in a government policy arena, that it's just something that's got to be watched out for, that the lure of the carbon money, whichever way you go with it, doesn't override the ecological importance of maintaining the grasslands.
Absolutely.
That's a really interesting comment, because this sort of puts us in the how purist are we going to be? And do we, if we're going to be doing revegetation stuff, I would have sort of said that a do no harm is probably a way to go. So look, if you're getting funding to put in some sort of vegetation, as long as it's not crunchingly out of place, it's probably better than nothing at all. I mean, I know that's throwing the discussion open a bit wider, and yeah, there's plenty of arguments in favour of having good provenance and having the right species and not having things that are going to compete with one another. But we're not in a pristine environment. We're never going to recreate a pristine environment. Do we accept the best we can do? Anyway, just throwing that one out.
No, it's a really good point, but I think our particular grassland is definitely in the very precious zone, so we won't be treeing it out. But
fair enough, totally.
But that's right. You know, there's probably areas where it wouldn't really matter if they've got some good native provenance happening on well degraded grassland.
Yes, well, as a person who was actually planting trees across Derrimut Grassland Reserve in the 1980s, to my ultimate shame, I'm not in a good position to talk here.
No, but you were doing what we knew about then, weren't you? So I mean, that's it. Our knowledge keeps changing, and I think it's important to remember that.
Yeah.
Okay, very good, people. We should probably wind up here. It is all heading towards 8 o'clock. There's lots of stuff in the chat. If people want to look and grab anything there, Steve is talking again on the Mount Cole Grevillea on the 12th of April. So that's something to look out for. All sorts of things going on, of course. There's difficult questions about the consensus on the Miyawaki method, which I don't even know what that is, but we're just going to have to pass over that. I'm sorry, Fatima, because it sounds very interesting. It's let's just all give Steve a huge thank you, because he has definitely opened our mind to a lot of stuff that wasn't there before. So brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Bags of fun.
Thanks for listening. Nice to meet you. Oh, I might do. I go and you have your meeting. Is that right? I'm hungry.
Yeah, that's it. You go eat. We're going to take a break until 8 p.m. So good. 7 minutes, folks. And I'll see you back here for our regular meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to me. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.